and welcome to ADIPEC Energy Dialogues, a series of conversations with experts from around the world, bringing you up to date in terms of what's impacting your market. Now, of course, the focus for the health and the future of any industry is very, very much dependent on the strength of the global economy, and something everybody is keeping an eye on as we go through this pandemic and as we go through this crisis. Of course, when we look back, we'll be checking all of the segments of the industry. And one very important area, of course, for ADIPEC is the offshore and the marine sector. I'm Ethna Trainer, and I'm your host for this session. And I'm absolutely delighted now to be joined by the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping. Guy Platten joins me. Guy, thank you so much for taking the time.
You're very welcome, Ethna.
Guy, talk to me about the fallout from COVID-19 when we look at it. We see what's happening with the oil and gas price, but also when we look at what's happening with shipping, and particularly when we look at probably 90% of goods around the world absolutely dependent on the shipping industry. Bring us back through the last few months and bring us up to date in terms of the health of the industry at the moment and the fallout from COVID-19.
There's no doubt that shipping plays a vital role in the world economy. It's the oil really that keeps the machine running. And we sort of saw the effects of COVID-19 right early in January, when China effectively shut down and went to the first country to go into lockdown and basically shut its factories. And this had an immediate effect on shipments out of China. And we've just seen a ripple effect from that. So, and then from about the middle of March, when effectively the rest of the world's economies, the major economies, shut down for considerable periods of time. So right the way through this, we've seen shipping being affected, sectors being affected. We saw the massive drop in crude oil prices, which had bizarrely enough, had a massive increase in the charter rates for tankers as a result, because everyone was trying to store the oil and move it around. So it's been a real roller coaster for shipping in general. But one thing I'm really proud of throughout all of this, the ships and particularly our seafarers have carried on making sure the world's kept supplied throughout this pandemic. And that's something I hope at least countries will recognise as we move out of this.
And I think we're all the recipients of that. I think everybody, got their food, got their goods. One of the areas that was so busy, I think, was delivery from indeed around the world. There was, of course, some hiccups in supply chains along the way. But as you say, when we look at the bigger picture, we actually see an industry that kept moving and kept delivering. When we look back on the last few years, and we've seen some sort of optimistic growth, more than 2% in this industry over the last couple of years, the last 4 years, really, despite what's been going on. But how do you think the industry is looking now? We're looking at, we have been looking at looming trade wars. We're looking at geopolitical issues. It's tough being a shipper and a mariner out there sometimes, isn't it?
I think it is, and actually it would be worth saying that today is the day of the seafarer. It's a day for the world to recognise the value of what all seafarers do on every single day, day in, day out, 365 days a year. I think it's a complex question you ask, really, because what is going to happen in the future? We'd like to think that in the short term, as the major economies move out of the lockdown restrictions, there'll be an upturn in trade as things catch up. So we could perhaps looking forward in the second half of the year, maybe, and into next. But actually, you raise an interesting point. I think something we're fearful of is perhaps a rise in protectionism. A complete look at their markets, I think, moving out of this, and how that affects shipping. And there's no doubt that protectionism is always detrimental in the long run. Free trade lifts people out of poverty, and we've seen great strides forward in that. And I think particularly with the mass unemployment, which is being talked about now, and all these other things, that we don't lose those gains and we don't go into ourselves as countries and must look at the bigger picture. So it is a worrying time in terms of that.
Yes, we've seen some supply disruption around the world. Have there been areas that have been hit more than others? And again, where have those supply chain disruptions been? Are we looking at point of origin? Shipping, have ships been just caught in the seas, or actually, point of departure at the ports?
So I think, as I said at the start of this, it's been a gradually moving picture. So we had China with issues there, where you had actually containers stacked up in Shanghai, and so there was a disconnect, because it's a very efficient, well-oiled machine that goes on. So when you get a stoppage somewhere, it has a knock-on effect elsewhere. But largely we've got through those problems. There's no doubt that trade volumes are down at the moment, and that's affecting shipping in a big scale. We hope that rebounds, but actually what shipping is always resilient. It always finds a way to get the trade and the goods moving, and that's one thing that the industry is exceptionally good at. I mean, ships are by their very nature mobile assets, so they can to move where the trade is.
And indeed, when we look at the relationship, I suppose, with the oil supply in the world, there's almost a symbiotic relationship there. We look at the health of the global economy, we look at goods moving around, we look at oil, making sure that it fuels transportation around the world. How does the volatility in the oil price impact the shipping industry at the moment, and indeed, throughout any time in history?
Well, it's a tale of lots of on one hand, actually ship owners are benefiting from very low oil prices, low bunker prices. We had a real issue at the start of this year was the introduction of the sulfur regulations, the IMO 2020, which reduced the maximum composition of sulfur down to 1%. We thought that was going to have a major disruption effect, but of course, then the collapse of the crude oil price, that differential between low sulfur and high sulfur fuel for those ships fitted with scrubbers and the like, that's sort of, that economic case has gone really for the time being. So we've seen sort of low oil prices, and then on the other hand, we've seen on the tanker market an increase in charter rates because there's so much oil around, it has to be stored somewhere. So that's really been the effect of the oil. And long term, of course, is how much that will recover, or whether we're actually seeing a fundamental change in the way societies move, in terms of oil demand. That's something that will play out in the next few months and years, I'm sure.
It will indeed. And again, I suppose everybody has an opinion at the moment. Some people saying we're going to see more regionalization, which will still be good because there's lots of big regions around the oceans in terms of where countries have to be served from. But, it's anybody's guess, I think, and we have to sit and watch that one out.
I think one thing that many countries have learned from this is the fragility of the supply chain and how robust it actually is. And there is no doubt that is going to have some impact on shipping moving forward. Particularly you hear all the stories about PPE, personal protection equipment, and sourcing that from around the world. I would imagine that countries are going to look at those supply lines going forward in case there is a resurgence of this disease, or indeed new diseases come along. So I think there's going to be a degree of deep analysis of this going forward, and how long and how stretched you want your supply chain to be.
Indeed, and every industry needs to take care of that. Every industry needs to be really looking at it. When we look back at the IMO regulations, particularly on the low sulfur fuel, I remember doing conferences a year ago and everybody was very worried about that. The industry seems to have managed that fine and got through it. But we're looking at stronger and more stringent regulations coming on board from IMO looking ahead to 2050. Is the industry ready for this, or is there just a little bit of fear in the industry right now, as is probably the case? It will be when we have this, we have a few years leeway in terms of when this actually is going to happen.
So with regards to just take the 2020 a little bit, obviously the collapse of the oil prices, as that's been a major factor there. But there has been some reports of concerns with regard to the quality of the oils and sludge and other things going on. So it's not been completely without incident. So there is things that are happening there. But you're right, as an industry, we're solid moving on from that, although keeping an eye on that. The next big thing is the greenhouse gas reduction, the ambitious targets to cut greenhouse gases by 50% by 2050, which in effect means the industry has to switch to very low or zero carbon fuel ships from the 2030s onwards. So there's a real recognition that this is coming down the tracks, and so I suspect that the COVID pandemic came on was on right at the top of agendas of boards, and it's still there, and it won't go away. And when this is over, and it will be over, we will focus once more upon the climate change issues and the greenhouse gas issues. As an industry, we recognise a lot more needs to be done in terms of research and development. What is the fuel of the future? Is it going to be ammonia? Is it going to be methanol? Is it going to be batteries? Is it going to be hydrogen? What is it? Is it going to be a mixture of all of them? With that, we don't know. And what we need to do is to focus research. So not at whether these things work, but how they can be used at scale. And then if you think about even if you do choose a particular fuel for the future, what's the supply chain for that going to be like? What's the infrastructure? And that's that real dialogue that we need to have, not just with shipping, but also with nation states as well, as to how this is all going to work. It's going to be a fundamental shift. Now, as an industry, we launched a proposal at the end of last year for a research and development fund. This is effectively ship owners would pay per tonne of fuel an amount which would go into a central fund, which could then be used to help accelerate this research and development and actually produce the solutions which we're all going to need going forward. So it's very much on the agenda now. In fact, although in my day-to-day job now at the moment, clearly COVID-19 is taking up a large part of my time, but in my secretariat, there's people now working on those greenhouse gas reduction solutions, both the short-term measures, what can we do now to reduce our emissions, but also in those longer-term solutions which you talked about. So this is going to be certainly the major challenge going forward.
Indeed it is, and when you look at the financing of big ships and financing for the industry as well, absolutely essential that money is there. And this is, we're talking about huge commitments and huge funding. The financial industry also being very, very cautious, being very, very careful about environment, social and governance, the ESG, which is, very topical and top of their agenda in many ways. How is that impacting the shipping industry in terms of getting the financing? And indeed, has the industry come together to embrace this and make sure they've got solutions in place?
I think there's plenty of initiatives out there in terms of green finance, and that's to be welcomed as well. But an important component of that is the research, because you can only finance green shipping if you've got the green shipping to finance. So it's a real chicken and egg situation here. And it's causing a dilemma to some ship owners in that, what do you order now? And that's a real issue, is what ships are you building which will give you some longevity over the next decade or 2 or 3 decades. And we think of 2050 as a long way away, but actually it's less than 30 years now.
Absolutely, and 2020 came, upon us very, very quickly, didn't it?
It did, and you look at the average lifespan of a ship is 25-30 years. So, what's the longevity of the ships we build today? Are they going to be able to last till 2050, or is there going to be a different solution? And these are strategic dilemmas which I haven't got the answers for today. But that's why we want our R&D fund. We want governments to embrace it, to work with us, and to deliver it through the International Maritime Organization. Now, that was meant to be discussed back in March at one of the key meetings of the IMO, and that's going to be put back to the autumn now. But we're very focused on making sure we start coming up with these solutions, and that we don't let the COVID-19 pandemic distract from those longer term issues, which will not be going away. Now,
you have a very impressive career in the industry. You've been a mariner all your life. You're very, very close to what's going on here. And given your role now, of course, you're very close to just about everybody in the industry. But talk to me a bit about what you have seen are probably the biggest changes in your career, and indeed in the lifetime of the shipping industry, in the last few decades.
It's when I went to sea, it was in 1980s. It was a different world then in terms of the equipment on board the ships. I think what we see now is far more automation. We've seen smaller crews. We've seen digitalization. I think that's going to accelerate now, and we think even some of the benefits of the last 3 or 4 months has actually been to move to a much more online system in terms of surveys and other things, which will only speed up the efficiency of how we move. So there's things have definitely changed in terms of the technology. The skill set of our ship's crews have changed over time, and you can see that evolving even further. As we talk of rather than autonomous ships, which may be coming down, but more autonomy on board the ships, more automatic systems, more hopefully efficiency. One of the great things which will actually help with climate change as well is making sure that ships and ports are much more connected, so the ship arrives in a port when it's needed, rather than steaming at speed to a port and laying at anchor for some time. So we can see a much more efficient supply chain coming down as a result of all of this. So there's been huge changes, I think. And when I went to sea, you basically left harbour and there was some sort of satellite communications which cost an arm and a leg, but effectively you were on your own. Now everyone's connected 24/7, and broadband internet access and monitoring, all these things have changed over the years.
Talk to me though about the safety and the security, and particularly when it comes to cybersecurity. This has been a big issue in the oil and gas industry, in the energy sector, in the shipping sector, the aviation sector. How is it really playing out when we look at the maritime sector particularly? Because now, as you said, depending a lot more on, more modern automation and more high-tech operations, really.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I mean, because unless you've got the security of your digital, it's secure, then it's open to corruption, it's open to hacking. We've seen various stories of that, over the years. So cybersecurity is a vital issue for the industry. We've issued some guidelines of our own on this issue, and it's a continuing concern of ship owners to make sure that the more autonomous you make the systems, the more secure you need to make it. So it is a major area of concern that we all have to focus on. To get the benefits, we need to crack that particular nut as well.
Do you think the whole concept of cybersecurity now has been looked at with a lot more detail and looked at perhaps, from a higher level too? The board is involved, all of that, yes.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. I think companies who ignore cybersecurity issues do so at their peril. These are very strategic issues. We saw the incident, I think it was Maersk, when had a real issue with their cybersecurity 2 or 3 years back, which cost them an awful lot of money. So these things are very, very important to ship owners and to ship managers as well going forward.
Now, piracy on the high seas is not getting the attention it got many, many years ago, but it doesn't mean that it's gone. Tell me a little bit about how we're looking at and how the industry is actually managing to protect itself.
Really good point. Piracy hasn't gone away. It's still there in various forms. Our real concern now, the industry, is in the Gulf of Guinea. And the violence being meted out to the ship's crews is of real concern. The modus operandi has changed from trying to sort of steal ships and cargoes to trying to kidnap crews and then holding them for ransom. That seems to be the way. And some of the awful stories that come out of that, it's just heartbreaking, tragic, and it's just something that, unfortunately, and you quite rightly say, doesn't command the attention as it should do. We had a meeting on that just yesterday, but it's still there, and it's not getting any better at the moment. And it's something that, as an industry, we need to bring to the attention of governments, because this has to be solved at a political level. As happened off Somalia 10, 12 years ago. So it's still rife now in the Gulf of Guinea, and something that needs addressing.
Now, of course, geopolitical issues around the world, this is just something that many of the ships just find themselves in, not intentionally most of the time. But again, this is still a huge issue. It's an issue for your people, it's an issue for management, and an issue for, I suppose, the profitability and the movement, the free movement of goods and people and everything like that. What are the plans in place, and how does the industry look at the bigger geopolitical story?
We obviously watch very closely. I mean, and the most important thing is us to keep still making the case for trade. That's the most important role that we've got to do. That actually trade is what breaks down barriers between countries. Trade is what lifts people out of poverty. And actually, we need to constantly make that case, even more so now with all what's going on. It's that shipping plays a vital role and continue to play a vital role. I think at the start of this interview, you said 90%, absolutely 90% of everything that moves, transported at some point in its journey, is on a ship.
Now, looking at that supply chain and looking at the need to make sure that that is still in place very much, when we hear about the trade talks falling apart with China, with America, at the moment things are looking good, but we've seen that before and we've seen a reverse. How will this impact global shipping, and how will it impact? I mean, trade wars is probably something that makes everybody in shipping a little bit nervous.
I think any sort of disruption in trade is always problematic, but it's really interesting because ships are mobile assets, they can shift, and that's a really important consideration. We're very adaptable, very resilient, so we'll shift to where the markets that are trading are, and we've seen that, even drawing some of the so-called trade war between the United States and China. So, it's obviously, in an ideal world, these things are resolved and trade volumes remain and go up and benefit all the countries. But, that's I think the beauty of shipping, how it adapts to the current scenario. But clearly it is a concern.
Talk to me more about digitalization of this sector too. And we've talked about automation, and we've talked about the, high-tech control rooms and how it's going to look different, autonomous vehicles and vessels rather. What's the difference that it's making? And we'll come to it in a minute too. I want to talk about the people involved in this. But how is digitalization impacting the industry right now?
Well, it's a gradual process. I mean, we hear talk about autonomous vessels, crewless vessels, but I think that's quite some way off now.
And would this be a good or a bad thing? Depending on what shipping conference I'm at and depending on who's talking, I've actually heard both sides.
Yeah, well, my own view is it's. I think what will happen is we'll reinvent the wheel. So if you have a crewless ship, it's going to be maintained at some point. So someone's going to probably, so that's part of the role of the crew. So, and also a ship already, unlike a truck, which, you're limited to the hours that a driver can do. So you can see an autonomous truck could really speed things up and become things. A ship already works 24 hours a day. So the cost savings are marginal at the moment in terms of that. When you compare with the redundancy of systems and equipment you put on. So I'm not saying autonomous ships won't happen, but I think it'll be a much more gradual process. What we will see, in my opinion, is more autonomy on board ships in terms of systems, which will perhaps result in a smaller crew on board the ships. And the skill set for those crews, I think, will change. And that's something we're focused on. So one of the things we've been calling for as an organisation is a review of the what's called the STCW, which is the global training standards for seafarers, because we need to have them fit for purpose to adapt to the new world, whether it be more autonomous ships in terms of systems, but also if there's new fuels or other things that come along, we need to make sure that can adapt to meet the needs of the future.
Now, when we look at particularly training that's in place right now, educational systems, global standards, all of that, are you getting the people that you need on board these ships to make sure that this almost hybrid skill set that's needed at the moment is there in place to secure the ship, to make sure that it's safe, secure, and that the people on board are actually safe and the ships are traveling well?
Yeah, well, the companies invest a huge amount in training, getting the right crews. It's always difficult to attract young people into an industry which is, for a large part, out of mind, out of sight. And we've noticed that during this pandemic, when we've had the awful situation of crews not being able to get off and not being able to be relieved. They really are a forgotten army of people, which is a real issue. And
I know you've been very passionate about that. Tell me just a little bit about what has been happening and what you've been able to do to make sure that people are managing to get home safe and that these ships are actually, and these vessels are being moved back to their ports and destinations.
So it's an ongoing crisis. It hasn't by no means solved yet, and it's very frustrating. We reckon there's well over 200,000 seafarers who are due to come off ships now, and another 200,000 to come on. And there's two sides to this problem. Firstly, the people stuck on board the ships, they're getting tired. They're getting, mentally and physically tired. Safety considerations. There's real issues around that. There's a real threat to the global supply chain. Actually, there's a ticking time bomb there. You can't keep working people continuously. And on the other side, you've got crews who are waiting to join ships. Some of them aren't being paid, and their families depend on them. So it's a real humanitarian issue. And how it links into your first question about that is, how attractive does that make seafaring going forward? And we need those skilled people. It's a highly skilled job. You go onto the bridge, the control center, if you like, of a modern ship, and you're staggered by the amount of equipment which is there, which is keeping the ship safe. And all that needs highly trained, highly motivated people to operate it. And that's perhaps a concern going forward, making sure we get that pipeline of intelligent young people coming into our industry who can then are the future leaders in 10, 20 years' time.
So while there's, clearly a lot of challenges at the moment, I think challenges, as there are challenges for every other industry out there, but particularly in the shipping, and it's huge demand, I think, on the shipping industry to make sure that every other industry is served in many ways. People waiting for parts, people waiting for all sorts of goods and services from around the world to get there. But there is an indication that, if any industry is going to hopefully do possibly a lot better. It's probably the shipping industry when economies are opening up and that demand is coming back in place. What are your sort of aspirations, I suppose, and your hopes for the industry, particularly as we go into the second half of this year and indeed to 2021?
Well, I think firstly is that we obviously hope that the recovery which has been promised is going to be V-shaped, so it's going to be swift and dynamic, and shipping will adapt to that as quickly as possible. So I think our hope is that that happens and shipping will get through this. But undoubtedly, there's some, you look at the cruise industry, it's been decimated by this whole pandemic, and when that's going to restart at scale is I can't predict. But they're taking a huge hit. Other sectors, like the ferry sector, have taken a huge hit with loss of passengers. Other sectors have done relatively okay out of this, and we hope as we move into the recovery that they will continue to do so. So I hope, though, that we learned some of the benefits that we've learned over the last 3 months. It's accelerated our learning. It's certainly, I've seen unprecedented levels of cooperation between various agencies and the industry. And that, I think, puts us in good stead as we move forward to the next challenge, which will be the climate change and economic recovery.
Indeed, a lot there that everybody really has to take care of and keep, number one in mind, I think, at all times. Now, of course, offshore and maritime, very, very important to ADIPEC, and an area, I think, in the last few years, too, that has been so active and people have been very, very involved in it. And really, it embraces the whole global economy. It embraces oil and gas. It embraces energy. It really embraces, I think, the future of the world economy and the future of the success, really, of our world. So we really have to always be looking out for what's going on in the shipping sector. So from the International Chamber of Shipping, I really, really want to thank you for taking the time. The Secretary General, Guy Platten, there. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, to all of you at home, thank you for being with us. Thank you for being part of this series, the ADIPEC Energy Dialogues. We'll keep you up to date, so stay in touch. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you very much.